Good morning. Tuesday, November the 5th, the date Americans go to the polls. I think the consequences of the election result will be truly monumental, not only for the US domestically, but the global economy and for many of the very serious macro geopolitical situations we have around the world. Is a Trump victory inevitable? And what would Trump version 2 look like for foreign and trade policy? It's a great pleasure to be able to review some of these immensely important topics with two eminent and respected experts. I should add we're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, so please get your comments ready. Firstly, Charles Myers. Charles, you're chairman and founder of Signum Global, and you operate at the intersection of policy and global markets. Could you tell us more about your current work and perhaps your international reach through London, Dubai, and elsewhere?
Yeah, just first of all, Zach and Raha, thank you for having me back, by the way. This is the best alternatives conference in the world by far, this one and Dubai. So it's great to be back. And I'm relieved not to be speaking about China for a change, because I'm very bearish, but instead on Trump. Yeah, so our firm, we're a global geopolitical risk firm based in New York, Washington, San Francisco, London. We have an office here, Dubai. We're opening in Mexico City in June. We look at all the big macro and geopolitical volatility events around the world, whether it's Trump and our election, the war in Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, US, China. So we look at all of those events. We have about 210 clients around the world, buy side as well as big corporates.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to have Greg Swenson with us. Greg, you're a senior partner and founder of Brigg Macadam. Could you tell us a bit more about the activities of Brigg Macadam and also your involvement in politics?
That's great. Thanks again for having me. The great conference, and really looking forward to the rest of it. So thank you again. Yeah, my firm, Brigg Macadam, is a smaller boutique merchant bank. We invest in infrastructure and agriculture, mostly in emerging markets, although we do have a couple of projects in Australia right now, all built around food security. So even most of our infrastructure projects are built around food security, all with a bit of a geopolitical flavor. Most of what we do, almost everything, is in some way in competition with China and Belt and Road, especially in Africa, where most of our activity is, but even in other markets. I was involved in conservative politics in the US. I moved here to London 9 years ago and got involved in Republicans overseas. So that's really elevated my activity level in the Republican Party and conservative politics in general. So again, great to be here.
Thank you indeed. Charles, as we know, anything can happen between now and November the 5th. As we kick off our discussion, could you give us your base scenario as to the likely outcome of the election?
Sure, and just on that informal poll a couple minutes ago, I'm absolutely convinced, I'm pretty sure more than a quarter of you think Trump's going to win. If we had done it anonymously, there's a lot of silent Trump supporters in this room, let me tell you. A lot of closet Trump supporters, because I did this poll. I spoke at the JP Morgan APAC conference in Singapore. We did the poll anonymously, electronically. 75% Trump. Spoke at a conference in Miami 2 weeks ago, all buy side, not just Florida, all buy side in Miami. 68% Trump. So it has become a consensus that Trump's going to win around the world, including in the States, by the way. And I'd say on the buy side, an even higher conviction consensus. Our base case is the opposite. We think it's a Biden re-elect with divided government, but in the opposite way of today. We think the Republicans will take the Senate, the Democrats the House. I think that last part of divided government is consensus. Where we're out of consensus now is for the Biden re-elect. And at a sort of very high level, here's what I'm watching. First of all, there are several things that are new this cycle that we, I think, all need to be watching to try to predict the outcome. The first is it's going to come down to 5 states, not 7 like last cycle. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona. If we follow polling in those 5 states, that's going to tell us who's going to win, not 6 months out, but as we get closer. Secondly, 90% of Americans have already made up their minds, 90%. So put a different way, there are only 10% undecided. It's an all-time record low. So if the entire election is going to come down to 10% of voters in 5 states, it's the most narrow election in the entire history of the country. The third issue, and it matters in every election, but especially in one as narrow as this, is voter turnout. And this is where I think Biden still has the advantage. Since the Supreme Court decision on abortion in June of 2022, the Democrats have won every special congressional election across the country, including in Alaska, which they never win. In the midterm elections, I think the most predictive or most telling preview of this upcoming election were the midterms back in November of 2022. You remember polling and the narrative was very negative for the Democrats. Biden at that point had a record low approval rating. It's actually lower today, by the way, but at that time it was a record low. Secondly, inflation, although it had peaked, was actually 7.5% on election day, 7.5% inflation. Price of gasoline, very high. Polling showed the Democrats were going to lose 25 to 30 seats in the House. They ended up only losing 5. Polling showed the Democrats were going to lose the Senate. They kept the Senate and gained a seat. So what polling has failed to capture, literally for the past 2 years, has been outperformance by the Democrats at the polls on everything from special congressional elections, the midterm elections, and abortion referenda. My point is, I think we're going to see record turnout by women and Democrats. For Democrats, more broadly, Trump being on the ballot is a major, major driver of turnout as well. So just 2 last quick points, just things to watch as we're going forward. You know, people will like to say part of the pushback on our Biden call is everyone's tired of talking about abortion. Everyone's, you know, the Supreme Court decision was 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago, but it is very much on the ballot. It's so much on the ballot in November, this coming November, that President Trump had to issue a video 2 weeks ago distancing himself from his own party on this issue. It's absolutely on the ballot. Secondly, there will be ballot initiatives on November 5th on abortion access, including in Arizona, one of the swing states, also in Florida, by the way. So it's a major, major issue. And so my point on that is the Supreme Court, when they made this decision in June of 2022, they did 2 things. First, very intentionally, took away a federal right that had been in place for 51 years. 51 years. Very rare in a democracy, almost unheard of in a democracy, to take away a federal right. In this case, one that affects 50% of the population and men like me who really care about this issue. The second thing the Supreme Court did, inadvertently, was give the biggest electoral gift to the Democrats in modern history. Because the Democrats who can't message anything, literally cannot message anything, have done a really good job on this because 70% of Americans are pro-choice. Very, very straightforward. So we'll watch that. One last quick thing, if I can. Part of the other pushback on our call is never underestimate Trump. Never underestimate Trump. And I always say, look, that was true in 2016. The whole world, even he didn't think he was going to win. There's that famous TV interview at like 1 in the morning at Trump Tower before he went over to his victory party at the Sheraton. And he's like a deer in headlights. He's like, oh God, holy shit, I just won. I just won. And Melania's standing there crying because she's like, oh God, I have to be first lady. You know, like we were supposed to go into this to raise our brand. And you know, everyone underestimated him in 2016. But what I say here today in 2024 is let's not overestimate him either. Let's be clinical, let's be analytical and focus on the following. First, he lost in 2020. He lost from the incumbency of the White House. 82% of presidents, US presidents, have won re-election from the White House. He's joined a very small club of presidents that have lost re-election from the White House. A very big deal. Secondly, he lost to the guy he's running against today, just to keep that in mind. Lastly, very quickly, the midterm elections also very telling. Every single one of Trump's endorsed candidates in the gubernatorial and Senate races, every single one of them lost except for J.D. Vance. And I always point to Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, the Democrats put forward John Fetterman for Senate. He had a stroke on the campaign trail. He was in the hospital almost the entire campaign. He still beat Trump's candidate. The Democrats almost put a dead person forward and still won. So let's not overestimate Trump either. Let's be clinical.
Thank you. Well, that's a bit nuanced, I must say.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Greg, now I'm going to ask you the same question.
Yeah.
What is your baseline, sir?
So I think Trump will win, but I can't promise that Trump will win. I'm not as confident as many people are right now. It's still early. The Republicans have a great track record of finding a way to lose, in elections that they should win. The conditions are really perfect for Trump. You have a complete different scenario versus 2020, when Biden was considered the candidate of unity, the candidate of sanity, bring normalcy back to the White House. And things have changed. And I think what we have now is it's going to be a referendum on 2 administrations. And if it ends up being just that, Trump will win. But I'm with Charles. This is going to be really close, and it's all about voter turnout and voter registration. The Democrats did a good job, often overlooked about the midterms. It wasn't just abortion. Yes, they made it an issue. It didn't poll as an issue. It's never ranked in the top 5. But the Democrats did a good job of making it an issue. The other challenge was, the messaging from the Republicans was horrible in 2022. But often overlooked is the ability of the Democrats to get into key swing districts and find voters. So the polls were all indicating a big Republican red wave based on likely voters. What the Democrats do a great job of is finding unlikely voters, and that was a big difference in 22. Now the question is that still possible? The Democrats have become the party of the college-educated voter. Those voters tend to vote in these off-year elections, the midterms, the special elections. So this one is going to be different in the sense that you'll have much bigger, I would think, a much bigger turnout of non-college educated voters, and that helps Trump, obviously. And just to keep in mind that I think the Republicans, I hope, will articulate much better on abortion. And I think one of the things you're starting to see from Republicans is arguing, or at least making the argument, that the Democratic policy, or at least Biden's, the way he articulates it, is taxpayer-funded abortions up until birth. That polls at 13%. It also polls at 18% with Democrats. So I think what you'll see is a little more clarity from the Republicans on what they're for, what they're not for. So we'll see if that maintains or if that stays as a big issue. But let's face it, the border, inflation, and foreign policy are the big issues now. Foreign policy typically doesn't rank in American politics. This time it does. In '84 it did with Reagan during the Cold War. George W. Bush in 2004, because it was right after 9/11. So this is kind of a 20-year cycle. Every 20 years it elevates. Typically it's the economy, stupid, and that's it. But this year we have inflation in the economy, the open border, and foreign policy. Trump is outpolling Biden on all of those. So that really favors Trump. The other difference, and I won't bore you with statistics, but the difference, again, between now and 2020 is Biden was perceived as the adult in the room, again, bringing normalcy back. Handling a crisis, strong record as president, dealing with inflation and cost of living, necessary mental and physical health, Trump 45, Biden 26. Competent and effective, Trump 47, Biden 36. These are all areas where Biden was up 10 points or more in 2020, and on those same issues, he's down anywhere from 10 to 25. So problem? Trump should be up in the polls much more, and that shows you the flaws of Trump and the fact that this is why 75% of Americans didn't want to see Trump v. Biden again. This is why both are unpopular. If with these conditions, just much like 22 that the midterms that Charles pointed out, Trump should be leading by 10 points. This should be an easy one because of the conditions, and Biden's policies on the border polls in the high 20s, his handling of inflation and the economy, low 30s. So, this should be a really ripe election environment for Republicans and Trump. And unfortunately, it's not, because you have two deeply unpopular candidates. Again, 75% didn't want to see it. I would argue that this will be the election of who do you dislike less? And that's how a lot of voters are looking at this. So.
Could I just, as a follow-up, Greg, ask you what your view is to the composition of Congress is likely to be? I mean, do you think the Senate could possibly flip back to Democratic control?
No, Senate will definitely be Republican control, and that's just the map, okay? There's 34 senators up for election, 23 are Democrats. The 11 Republicans are all defending seats in states that Trump won in 2020 and 2016. So there's little doubt that the Senate will flip, and that's just the map. This, again, remember, this is the class of 2018, which was, a very, very good year for Democrats. It's the class of 2012, when Obama was on the ballot, another great year for Democrats, and 2006, which was a very big year for Democrats, where they flipped the House and the Senate. So this will be, I think, an easy one to call. 7 of those 11, or 8 of the 11, are considered toss-ups. And so I'm very confident Republicans win. The House is a little harder. If you asked me 6 months ago, when the generic Republican or the generic polling on the House favored Republicans, which is very rare. It was like 45 to 43. Very unusual, but the Democrats have come back. Having the chaos in the House with the Speaker, with McCarthy, that's probably not helped the cause for the House. So that's going to be a little harder to predict. Senate's an easy one. The White House, again, I'm confident, I'm hopeful, but it's going to be really close.
Right. Thank you very much. Charles, when Trump was first elected in 2016, he kind of had a Paul Ryan-flavored agenda in his in-tray, and he was constrained by some establishment types. I'm thinking of Tillerson, Matheson, Wilbur Ross, and so on. Trump seems to have surrounded himself by some pretty hard-line loyalists and have a very effective team surrounding him. Could you give us some of your predictions on the important issue of who's likely to be in the cabinet?
Yes, so I'm actually not a believer in the sort of it's mostly a Democratic narrative that Trump's only going to hire yes people or very weak people. The truth about the Trump campaign this cycle is it's incredibly professional. It's actually very well run, very organized, very disciplined. And part of that discipline is their trial ballooning names for Fed chair, Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State, VP as well. And so, when you look at all the names, they're very impressive, right? So, for example, for U.S. Treasury, it's everyone from John Paulson to Jeff Yass, Scott Bessent, all come from financial services. Bob Lighthizer possibly is on there. I think the Trump campaign keeps floating Jamie Dimon's name, and I can tell you Jamie has no interest in that job, but it makes them look good. I'm convinced Trump's going to ask Steve Schwartzman, by the way, to be Treasury Secretary. He'd be excellent. The initial rumor was Vivek Ramaswamy, which God help us, I'm here to tell you is not going to happen. But I think those are really impressive names for Treasury, for example. Fed chair, it's everybody from Kevin Warsh, Kevin Hassett, Arthur Laffer, Steve Moore. Again, all very impressive names. So I feel pretty good about that. I think on VP, it's a little more complicated, because it is a role where you could be upstaged, and I think that's an issue for actually not only Trump but all presidents. So I think on the VP shortlist, and again, the campaign is trial ballooning these names. I think Tim Scott, senator from South Carolina, is at the top of the list, but everyone from J.D. Vance to Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Elise Stefanik, again, a revolving list of mostly impressive names. I'm still convinced he's going to pick Nikki Haley as VP. And I know people in Trump world swear it cannot happen. She's offended him in the primary. She hasn't endorsed him yet. I understand all of that. But Trump has some of the best political instincts in the country. This was a guy that was bankrupted literally multiple times and rose to the pinnacle of world power, literally, and was down and out and has come back again, right? So he has some of the best instincts in the country. If he picks Nikki Haley, it's a formidable ticket, right? Trump-Haley appeals to women, Democrats, others, and then the question is, would she take the job, right? Would she, because she's distanced herself from him, and I'm here to tell you, she would absolutely take that job. I mean, statistically, she'd be much closer to becoming president just de facto by being VP, just historically. But secondly, we focus a lot on Biden's age and cognitive issues, as we should. But let's not forget, Trump's about to turn 78, has diabetes, long COVID, and lives on cheeseburgers. I would take that bet. I would absolutely take that bet. She would become vice president if he asked her in a heartbeat.
Thank you very much. Greg, any comments on that topic?
Look, from an electoral perspective, Charles is right. Nikki Haley would bring the ticket. She has that appeal to moderates. She had a lot of Democrats supporting her in the primaries. She might even have some luck with suburban women. I think that's a little bit exaggerated. Married women support Republicans, according to the polling, married men and single men. The only demographic that there's a real weakness is single women. That I'm not sure that Nikki Haley would solve for that, but there is an argument to be made. It would really freak out people in the Trump camp, starting with Don Jr., to have Nikki Haley. So I don't see it. I've supported Ron DeSantis in the nomination process. I think that would be sensible, in spite of the fact that they're both from Florida. Trump has only been a Florida resident since early in his first term, I believe. So, he still is a New Yorker at heart. I don't think that would be redundant, but there might just be too much bad blood from the campaign between DeSantis and Trump. I would love Steve Forbes in Treasury. I think that would be fantastic. And then the sleeper that people don't talk about much is, I think we talked about it on our call, is Robert O'Brien, who was the last national security advisor for Trump, quietly, because it was after John Bolton, who was much more outspoken and much more controversial. Robert's kind of a steady, straight and narrow, low key. He's been in State Department. He was a hostage negotiator before he became National Security Advisor, and so I think he'd be great as Secretary of State. I think Rick Grenell might just be a little too controversial for that role. So. And again, I agree with Charles. This whole argument that nobody that's competent is going to work for Trump this time, it's just not true. I think there's a lot of people lined up. The Heritage Foundation is putting out a complete 2025 playbook with personnel recommendations as well as policy platforms. So he'll be much better prepared for Trump 2.0 than he was in 16 when it was just total chaos.
I had one more name. Sorry, because Greg mentioned it, Rick Grenell is the front runner for state. So you may remember Rick, he was our ambassador to Germany under Trump 1, and literally offended the Germans every single day. And so I always say, literally your number one job as ambassador is to not offend your host country, literally. But so I think we should, if true, we should expect an even more assertive State Department in a way. It's kind of interesting on that front. And one other name I forgot to mention for VP, apparently Melania really wants Tucker Carlson. So as a Democrat, let me just tell you, that would be such a gift. Yeah. Such a gift. Let's hope she prevails.
Well, look, we're going to leave some questions time, but too many topics we could discuss. I'd like to turn to foreign policy. Charles, you just touched on one or two aspects here. This is something that worries potentially all of us, I think. Policy towards NATO, towards European allies, towards China, towards Russia in the Ukraine situation. How do you view that from point of view?
Yeah, so I would just say on policy, domestically, if Trump wins, it's going to be not only fine, it's going to be very positive. It'll be a lot like Trump 1.0 before COVID, meaning lower taxes. Again, it'll be a big debate on extending the Trump tax cuts next year. If he's president, he has more leverage to extend more of the cuts, so more fiscal on that front, and a government that's very pro-entrepreneurship, pro-business, pro-market, right? So again, domestically, it's going to be, I'd argue, quite positive if Trump wins. The issues that we should be more concerned about is foreign policy, especially trade. He's running on 10% tariffs on all goods into the U.S. and 60% Chinese. And he's not going to do that because it would be instantly inflationary and shave about 1.5% off GDP, in the first year. What he is going to do instead, and this comes back to what I said about the Trump campaign being much more disciplined this time. They're very accessible and they're sharing information. And this is something I think it's really underappreciated here in Europe, mainly in UK Europe, which is that a second Trump administration intends to be very punitive towards the EU on trade. They're going to single out Airbus, autos, luxury goods, steel and aluminum, and make it quite punitive in a way that we could almost engage in a trade war with the EU. It's very personal for Trump. Part of it's the NATO issue that Europe doesn't spend enough on its own defense, et cetera. So we need to be prepared for that. Bob Lighthizer the guy to listen to. Project 25 is also very clear on this issue of being punitive. I think the U.S.-China trade war just continues. I don't think it gets worse. And then lastly, on foreign policy, Trump is running to pull us out out of NATO. The good news is he can't, because Congress in December, just this past December, passed a law, they put it in the NDAA, that no U.S. president can take us out of NATO without congressional approval. They wouldn't give approval. So Congress is already Trump-proofing some of our processes, by the way, thank God. And so, you know, what he will do is force European members to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, which he's right on. It's a requirement of being a member. So we should expect a much bigger increase, even bigger increase in defense spending if Trump wins. Last quick thing is he's running and promises to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. That is not going to happen either. But I do think if he wins, he will probably end the war within a couple months. I would argue that's a positive. I think he'll force the Ukrainians to the table, who are the main obstacles to settling today. But in that scenario, Russia gets almost all, they get all the Donbass and maybe even some more territory. Sanctions on Russia after the war, financial services, commercial aviation, under Trump will be negotiable, meaning they won't all stay on, whereas if Biden wins, sanctions stay on Russia long after the war. And I think in that scenario, Russia and U.S. companies will go back into Russia under Trump. Under Biden, no U.S. companies going back. So at the end of this war, if Trump wins, yes, the good news is the war is over sooner. The bad news is Russia's far more powerful. I would argue that's a bad thing and a bad outcome. But anyway, so just some very high-level thoughts on Trump. We need to be more worried about trade and foreign policy.
Thank you very much. Greg, could I turn to you, and perhaps we can just put a little bit of emphasis on the domestic policies in the States. I mean, affordable care, do you think that'll last? The drill, baby, drill, and the green energy policies? How do you see all of that?
Well, I think it's one of, Trump is often unpredictable, but there are a few areas where it is very predictable, and I think he would do his best to extend the 2017 tax reform. He might not have that choice if he loses the House. Remember, we actually did pretty well in 2020 in the House. The Republicans picked up 12 House seats in spite of Biden winning the White House. So if we can keep the House, then I think you'll see tax reform extended. You'll see the liberalization of the private sector, the supply side, which is critical. The biggest thing is energy policy, and he will definitely liberate that. He did it in his first term. It worked. The U.S. became not only energy independent, but the U.S. became the swing price in oil markets. And Biden came in day one, shut down the Keystone Pipeline, stopped with the federal leases. He did everything he possibly could to put his foot on the neck of the oil and gas sector. That made elevated prices, which was great for Putin, great for the mullahs in Iran, great for Venezuela, but not so great for the consumers who were facing inflationary pressure. So you'll see a real liberalization of the energy sector, and that'll be good for working people.
Thank you very much, Greg.